Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of our discussion of culture. So, as we know by now, it's really important for us to be, as members of a society, to be familiar with all the rules that help society to continue to function smoothly. We want to feel at ease. We want to feel secure in the place that we live. And so understanding our culture is really essential to us having a sense of well-being in our society. We also want to make sure that as we go about living our life day to day, we can count on other people to go by the same rules that we're going by. We don't want our social life to be too disrupted, because if it is, we experience what's called hyenomia or hyenomic conditions. That's the type of situation that you're in when you go out into the world and you can't count on everybody behaving in a similar fashion to you. We don't like to live like that. It's hard for us to live like that. And so from a cultural perspective, it's really important that we all decide to agree on at least some basic rules of conduct so that when we do go out in the world, we don't always have to second guess the people around us to see what they're going to do and how they're going to behave. A great example of this is driving. We have certain rules and regulations that we should all adhere to when we're driving our vehicle. And that's not really about us. It's not about the idea that I'm a really good driver and I know what to do and I'll always be defensive in my maneuvers. Therefore, I can drive however I want to drive. Driving expectations are really about all of us deciding to generally follow the rules of driving. We all stop at the stop sign. We stop when the light is yellow instead of blowing through a stoplight that's turning red. We stop behind the school bus and we understand the rules that we have to use when school buses are stopping to load and unload children. We don't cut people off. So these kinds of rules are not about you knowing that you're not going to collide with the person when you pull your car close in front of them, but rather it's about a basic element of courtesy and respect to the other drivers around you, because they expect you to drive your car using the same set of rules that they're using to drive their car. You may indeed be a very, very good driver, but the place to use that kind of behavior is on a closed driving range, not around regular everyday people who are going about their business trying to get to work or run an errand. All right, let's talk just about some basic definitions for a minute. We're going to talk about 3 different forms that culture can take: the mainstream, the subculture, and the counterculture. And then we're going to talk about 2 concepts that relate to culture: multiculturalism and assimilation. So when we talk about mainstream culture, these are attitudes, beliefs, experiences that tend to seem normal to us. Now remember, we're talking about the United States, and so we could go on to describe some of these kinds of mainstream cultural attributes in terms of the phrase pop culture or popular culture. These are things that are normalized or average to most Americans. We can think about it in terms of cultural events, baseball games, football, American football that is, a TV show that everybody loves to watch and discuss. We can also try to describe the mainstream in terms of what that looks like for America. We could talk about the concept of home ownership, although that is rapidly changing, and we might discuss that in our lecture on stratification. A mainstream attribute is earning a college degree and having a career. So mainstream cultural values or beliefs do change over time, but they are things that we can point to that help us to identify and articulate what our culture is in a normal kind of way or an average kind of way. Subcultural attributes are part of the mainstream, but they're not widely adopted yet. So when we define subculture, it's really just like it sounds. It's a smaller cultural group within the larger culture, within the mainstream. So people that are parts of a subculture are members of the mainstream, but also share a specific, unique identity that makes them part of that subculture. We can think of subcultural groups in myriad ways, ethnic groups, racial groups. Gender is a subculture. Because I live in Florida, we have a big subculture of bikers. We have Bike Week a couple times a year, I think, and people go there, they dress a certain way, they drive motorcycles, and they behave in a certain fashion that is acceptable to them. Then when Bike Week is over, they go back to their everyday life. They go back to the jobs they hold. They go back to essentially living as members of the mainstream. The third aspect of culture we want to talk about is the counterculture. These are groups that are distinguished from subcultures and from the mainstream because they tend to operate outside of the greater or larger society. These are groups that are trying to move against the dominant mainstream, or what we think of as the normal culture, and they instead want to overthrow the mainstream and work towards instilling their new values as the things that are established for that mainstream culture. In the United States today, we have a significant number of countercultural movements. We have terrorist organizations, we have political organizations, and we have social organizations that are actively working to try and significantly impact our mainstream values and ideals. It's not an accident that the word cult is part of the word culture. And they are considered to be countercultural groups also. And again, we have many examples in the United States of cults and how, unfortunately, while they claim to be spiritual groups and establish themselves as forms of religion, they end up working against what we consider to be religious norms and values, and oftentimes clash very severely with U.S. law, and can end up with members of the cults being abused, and sometimes end up with cults forming suicide pacts when their dreams don't materialize. And also, let's talk a little bit about the concepts of multiculturalism and assimilation. Multiculturalism and assimilation are both really essential components of how culture works for different groups in society. The United States is commonly referred to as a multicultural society. When I was a child, we were called a melting pot, but today, the new way to identify us is, rather than calling us a melting pot, we're called a salad bowl. And the reason for that is because a melting pot tends to put all groups together to try and form one thing, whereas a salad bowl allows each individual component to be identified on its own as part of the entire big salad, so to speak. It sounds a little silly, I know, but it's an easy way to remember it. So people who tend to be proponents of multiculturalism look for common ground that they can find among different groups and still allow them to maintain their distinct identity and their cultural practices. This is really important in a society that has a large number of immigrants in it, so that we can emphasize those multicultural values as being compatible with the mainstream rather than being opposed to the mainstream. And along with multiculturalism, we have to talk about the concept of assimilation, which is where minorities adapt to the dominant culture. And this is not always a positive action, but what we do see when we research the concept of assimilation is that groups that come here to the United States from other places generally tend to fully assimilate within 3 to 4 generations. And this means that they leave behind their traditions and their cultural heritage from where they came, and instead assimilate to the mainstream of American society. So these two terms, multiculturalism and assimilation, can tend to clash with each other when we're talking about cultural values and ideals. Another component of culture is the concept of cultural universals. Cultural universals are beliefs, behaviors that all societies around the world have been observed to share. These kinds of ideas or beliefs or behaviors revolve oftentimes around shared experiences, food, shelter, birth, death, regulation of sexual behavior. Religious experience is also a cultural universal. Cultural universals don't manifest themselves the same exact way in every culture around the world, but every culture around the world that has been observed does have ideas that surround these basic human ideas, beliefs, and experiences. And a couple of other universals that I don't have on my list here, which are kind of obvious. Music. Every culture in the world has some form of music that it shares amongst the people that live there. And also sports. We know that every single culture that we've had an opportunity to observe has some kinds of sporting rituals and events. All right, so just a few basics in this little discussion, and I hope this helps. All right, take care. Bye-bye.